In the heart of New York, on a narrow street where smoke from furnaces and the soot of candles hung above the stone sidewalks, stood an old opera house. Its massive wooden doors, adorned with intricate carvings, had long seen no fresh coat of varnish. The paint on the façade had peeled, and the sign with golden letters had long since dulled under layers of dust and city grime. The theater was famous not for its dazzling performances, but for the strange stories passed from mouth to mouth by audience members and actors alike. It was said that the mirrors in the dressing rooms and corridors could show more than mere reflections. On a cold December evening, when the fog from the river slowly crept along the streets, several townspeople arrived at the theater. Among them was a young lawyer named James Hale, known for his caution and rational mind. He did not believe in the rumors about the cursed mirrors. To him, it was merely an expression of urban superstition. He was accompanied by his sister, Elizabeth, whose nature was more impressionable. She loved mysterious stories and secrets, even if she was afraid of them herself. The first spectators took their seats in the hall, sensing the smell of old wood, dust, and a waxy amber scent rising from the lamps illuminating the theater boxes. The sounds of the streets, muffled by the thick walls, seemed distant and alien, while the stage remained cloaked in darkness. Before the performance began, several guests noticed that the mirrors along the corridors seemed strange. The movements of people did not always align with their reflections, and some silhouettes appeared distorted and tense. Elizabeth, unable to resist, approached one of the old mirrors in the foyer. She saw herself, but her reflection's gaze was strangely vacant, almost lifeless. "Do you see this?" she whispered to her brother, feeling a chill run down her spine. James looked and smirked. "Just a shadow, Elizabeth. Perhaps a trick of the light. Nothing more." However, the deeper they walked through the corridors, the more the sense of unease grew. In every mirror, the reflections of the audience seemed tense, as if some invisible force were forcing them to stand in anticipation of something dreadful. James began to notice that the movement of his hands and feet did not match the reflection. When he raised his hand, the reflection remained still, sending an unfamiliar chill of fear through him. When the theater lights went out before the start of the performance, a profound silence fell over the hall. The stage was empty, yet in the mirrors on the balconies and side boxes, glimpses appeared, not of the actors but of future scenes. And not involving others, the audience began to see in the mirrors their own tragic moments. James saw himself lying on a cold stone floor, with a figure nearby he could barely discern, but his heart knew it would mark his death. Elizabeth screamed, but her voice seemed unable to penetrate the thick theater air and reach anyone else's ears. Other spectators who noticed the strangeness at first assumed it was a clever use of lighting, some sort of illusion or trick. But when a man dropped a candle and saw himself hanging by a rope in the dressing room, panic spread like wildfire. People tried to flee, but the corridors seemed endless. In the mirrors, the scenes of horror repeated over and over, each glance confirming a personal nightmare that no one could logically explain. James, gathering all his strength, tried to calm Elizabeth. He explained that it was only reflections of fear, the human imagination running wild from exhaustion and darkness. Yet even he could not ignore that what the mirrors showed happened with an accuracy that could not be accidental. The longer he looked, the more clearly he saw moments from the future, seemingly inevitable. Inside the theater, a strange harmony of chaos emerged. People whispered, wept, shouted, yet no one could alter what they saw in the mirrors. Even the most skeptical began to feel the bone-deep chill of fear. When the performance finally began, it was unusually quiet. The actors moved slowly, as if aware of the dreadful events unfolding around them. The lamplight barely touched the stage, casting long shadows on the walls and reflecting them in the old mirrors. Every movement on stage seemed an exact replica of what the mirrors displayed, yet with slight variations, amplifying the sense of impossible premonition. The audience felt as though they had become part of a strange ritual. None of them could believe it was mere coincidence. The details were too precise, too vividly depicting their own tragedies, replaying in reflections. And as if by unwritten rules, every moment in the mirror offered a horror that could not be resisted. The Opera House in New York, 1850, proved to be a place where fear became tangible, where every step and movement was part of a silent performance of death. The mirrors were no longer mere glass. They became eyes, recording the impossible, dominating the minds of all who crossed the threshold of the old opera house. The audience sat frozen, each person ensnared by the mirror's silent horrors. Even those who had initially scoffed now found their rational minds battered by the relentless precision of what they saw. James gripped Elizabeth's hand tightly, trying to anchor both himself and her in reality. But it was no use. Reality had already become secondary, warped by the reflections surrounding them. In the dim light, every detail of the theater seemed sharper, more oppressive. The carved wooden boxes, the dust motes drifting lazily in the lamplight, the flickering shadows across the worn stage floor. All of it felt as if it were being meticulously arranged for an unseen audience that existed only in the mirrors. From somewhere deep in the theater, the faint creak of floorboards echoed, though no one moved. Each sound amplified the tension, a subtle punctuation to the unfolding dread. Elizabeth's eyes kept returning to a mirror near the back of the orchestra section. Unlike the others, this one seemed almost alive, capturing not only her reflection, but fragments of what might come. She saw herself, pale and trembling, reaching out for something, someone who never appeared. She turned to James, wanting to point it out, but the words stuck in her throat. He, too, was caught in a vision, a version of himself lying unmoving on a hard surface, while shadowy figures loomed nearby. The murmurs among the audience grew louder, but they were all muted, tense whispers. "It's the lighting. Some trick of the candles," someone said, though their voice lacked conviction. Another shook their head, voice trembling. I saw it. Myself, hanging." Panic began to ripple through the crowd, subtle at first, then spreading in waves. Some tried to leave, but the aisles felt unnaturally long, the doors impossibly far. It was as if the theater had expanded, a labyrinth designed to trap them within their own fear. James turned to find the stage clearer than before. A single figure emerged from the darkness, a stagehand or actor, he could not tell, which moved with deliberate slowness. Every motion seemed rehearsed, yet the figure never acknowledged the audience. The figure's reflection in the mirror behind the stage multiplied infinitely, a cascade of endless, silent watchers. James swallowed hard. His throat was dry, his mind racing to reconcile what he saw with reason. But no reasoning could pierce the oppressive weight of inevitability that pressed from every reflection. Elizabeth's breath quickened. She tried to speak to James again, but a wave of vertigo struck her as her reflection began to distort. She no longer saw herself, but an empty shell of a woman, eyes hollow, lips parted in a silent scream. Around her, others began to notice similar distortions. Faces stretched, shadows twisted, movements delayed. The theater was no longer a place of entertainment. It had become a hall of private revelations, each mirror showing its owner's deepest vulnerability and inevitable demise. In a corner of the balcony, a man clutched his chest and collapsed, eyes wide in terror. His reflection had shown him falling from a great height, and the panic in his body mimicked what he saw. Others gasped, some screaming, as one by one, every spectator was confronted with a personal glimpse of what might await them. The air thickened with fear, almost tangible, like smoke that refused to rise. James pulled Elizabeth toward the exit, trying to move against the creeping terror. But every corridor they entered seemed to stretch, twisting back upon itself. The mirrors multiplied endlessly, reflecting not just their own images but fragments of the theater they had just left. Every turn brought new horrors, a glimpse of someone they knew in a compromising or deadly position, shadows moving independently of bodies, fleeting glimpses of what could only be described as futures trapped in a cruel loop. The performance, if it could be called that, continued on the stage. Figures moved slowly, deliberately, as if aware that every step was mirrored in the audience's dread. The lighting flickered and warped, casting grotesque shadows that elongated across walls and floorboards. Each shadow seemed to respond not to the physical world, but to the fears of those watching. James felt as if the very air pressed against him, heavy with anticipation of tragedy he could neither prevent nor escape. Elizabeth stumbled into a box seat, pressing herself against the wall. Her reflection stared back at her, unchanged, calm, and yet she knew that calm was only the eye of a storm. The mirrors did not lie. They could not. Every reflection she had seen, every distorted shadow, had felt like a prelude to something unavoidable. James knelt beside her, gripping her hands, silently promising he would protect her, but he felt the futility of it immediately. Protection was irrelevant here. Understanding was futile. The mirrors demanded only observation. Outside, the night had deepened, and the fog pressed against the theater's windows. Inside, the panic had escalated to hysteria. Yet the theater itself seemed indifferent, ancient wood groaning under its own weight, dust motes drifting like spirits, lamps flickering but never extinguishing. It was a place suspended between time and inevitability, where fear was not a reaction but a currency, traded between reflections and those foolish enough to meet them. A sound, A whisper, perhaps a groan, rippled across the hall. James turned sharply, eyes scanning the crowd. Others noticed, too. Heads swiveled, whispers turned into tremulous gasps. But no figure was visible. Only reflections, infinite and inescapable, captured their attention. Each mirror presented a slightly different scenario, each more chilling than the last. One showed a child he did not know, clutching a lifeless parent. Another showed Elizabeth falling into an abyss, her scream echoing back at her before her lips moved. Time seemed to lose meaning. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The audience's attempts to flee were increasingly frantic, yet every exit seemed to lead only to another corridor lined with mirrors, each offering new visions, new fears. The theater had become a cage built not of walls, but of reflections. James finally realized that fear itself had weight here. The longer they looked, the heavier the air became, each heartbeat pounding in resonance with the horrors around them. No one spoke. No one moved except when compelled by the terror reflected back. Even the bravest found themselves paralyzed, unable to turn away. And in that suspended terror, the theater thrummed quietly, as though breathing. Shadows lengthened, reflections twisted. The audience understood in a deep, instinctive way that this place was a mirror not just of appearances, but of fate. The Opera House of New York in 1850 had become a monument to inevitability, a silent witness to every dread the human mind could conceive. The Haunted Opera House, New York, 1850. The air in the theater had thickened to a near liquid weight. Every breath was a labor, every heartbeat a drumbeat that echoed against the walls of the vast, oppressive hall. James and Elizabeth remained huddled together in a box seat, their eyes darting from mirror to mirror, each reflection offering a new, unbearable glimpse of what might come. The panic around them had escalated. Whispers had become frantic mutters. Mutters had become gasps, and gasps had become screams muffled against the heavy curtains of fear that hung over the audience like a suffocating fog. Elizabeth's hands trembled violently as she pointed to a mirror across the hall. James followed her gaze, and his stomach turned. The reflection was of a man seated in the front row, hunched over his own body as if already lifeless, eyes wide in terror, lips frozen in a silent scream. Behind him, a shadow stretched impossibly long, twisting around corners of the room that did not exist in reality. James swallowed hard, realizing that the mirror was not just showing a reflection. It was revealing what could happen, what might already be fated. A sudden commotion broke near the center aisle. A woman stumbled into a mirror, pressed her face against it, and screamed. Her reflection did not scream back. It merely stared, calm, indifferent, as if mocking her terror. Others rushed to help her, but as they moved, each mirror captured them in variations, some as they were, some as they would be, some distorted beyond recognition. James noticed that with each movement, each flinch, the reflections altered subtly, anticipating the next action before it occurred. Elizabeth clutched his arm. "James, we have to leave," she whispered, voice shaking. We can't stay here." Her gaze was fixed on a mirror near the stage, where she saw herself, but not the living version of herself she knew. This Elizabeth was pale, hollow-eyed, and staring directly at her from the glass with an intensity that seemed to pierce reality itself. James could feel a cold dread curling into his chest, a premonition he couldn't shake. He stood, pulling Elizabeth toward the nearest exit. But the corridors beyond the hall had changed. The doors led to winding passages lined with mirrors on both sides. Each step forward was mirrored a fraction of a second later, but the reflections were not exact. Sometimes their mirrored selves lagged, sometimes they moved ahead, sometimes they contorted in impossible ways. Panic tightened around them like a vice, each mirrored distortion amplifying the horror in their minds. A voice rang out from somewhere deep in the theater, though no mouth moved. It was low, guttural, and echoed off the walls as if the building itself had learned to speak. "You cannot leave." Every syllable resonated in their chests, vibrating in the air, though the theater remained empty of any visible source. The crowd murmured in terror, some falling to their knees, some screaming, but none could identify the origin. The mirrors reflected the sound, multiplying it, echoing it, bending it until it seemed to come from every direction at once. James realized that the theater was no longer just a structure. It was an entity, aware of their fear, feeding on it. Every reflection, every shadow, every flicker of candlelight worked together to trap them in a living nightmare. He pressed Elizabeth close, trying to shield her, but even as he did, he could see in a mirror to the left a version of himself turning his back, walking away from her into a shadowy corridor, vanishing completely. The vision was horrifying in its inevitability, yet he could not look away. A man in the audience screamed suddenly, clutching at his chest. James glanced back and saw the reflection of the same man sprawled across the floor, a ghostly pallor on his face, eyes wide and fixed in terror. When he turned again, the man in reality was still standing, shaking violently, but the mirror showed what would happen, what was only moments away. The audience began to realize a terrible truth. And the mirrors did not merely reflect, they predicted, exposed, and perhaps even dictated the outcomes they displayed. Elizabeth sobbed quietly, and James felt helpless. He tried to reason, to ground them both, but the theater seemed to resist logic. The walls of mirrors extended infinitely in all directions. Every movement they made, every decision to run or hide, was already anticipated, already displayed, already distorted. The corridors themselves seemed to bend around them, forming a labyrinth that trapped not bodies, but minds. Time had lost all meaning. Seconds stretched endlessly. Minutes and hours collapsed into one continuous moment of terror. The audience, already on the brink of hysteria, began to interact with the mirrors in desperation, touching the glass, screaming at their reflections, even trying to break them, but nothing changed. The mirrors held their images, and each alteration only deepened the sense of inescapable fate. James felt a cold, almost metallic sensation in his hands as he gripped Elizabeth. He glanced down at her reflection. In the glass, her image was already shriveled, contorted, and lifeless, an inevitable version of herself he could not prevent. Panic surged through him like an electric shock, yet he forced himself to focus. He realized that if they were to survive, they could not fight the reflections. They had to move carefully, slowly, deliberately, without succumbing to fear. But fear was a predator here. Every step forward was mirrored with variations of terror, each reflection feeding on the next, creating layers upon layers of dread. A shadow stretched across the hall like a living thing, reaching for anyone who dared look away from their own reflection. James felt it brush past him, a tangible presence that chilled his bones. The reflection of Elizabeth flinched, though she herself did not move. The mirrors were no longer passive. They had become actors in this macabre play, and the audience were unwilling participants. A sound like shattering glass reverberated from the far end of the hall. Several spectators screamed and ran blindly toward the nearest exit, only to find that every door led to another mirrored corridor. James and Elizabeth followed, hearts hammering, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. Their mirrored selves raced ahead, sometimes slowing, sometimes reaching out toward them with twisted hands, faces contorted in silent terror. Finally, they reached a landing where a single mirror hung, cracked, aged, and ominous. It reflected nothing but darkness. James took a deep breath and pulled Elizabeth close. "We step through together," he whispered, "no looking back." Elizabeth nodded, trembling, her hands clutching his as if their grip could ward off fate itself. As they advanced, the mirror before them seemed to stretch and deepen, forming an almost tangible void. Their reflections did not appear, only darkness, an emptiness that promised either freedom or annihilation. The theater seemed to inhale, a slow, deliberate intake of breath that pressed against their backs, urging them onward. Step by step, they crossed the threshold of the dark mirror. The oppressive weight of fear pressed on them, yet with each step, the clamor of the mirrors behind faded, becoming whispers, then silence. For the first time in hours, or was it days, James felt the possibility of relief, though he dared not let go of Elizabeth's hand. They emerged into a small, dimly lit room at the far end of the opera house, one free of mirrors. The air was cool, quiet, and mercifully still. Behind them, the echoes of the Hall of Mirrors lingered faintly, a memory of terror that would haunt them forever. Every reflection, every distorted shadow, every glimpse of inevitable death had been seen, endured, and survived, though none could say how much of what they had witnessed was real and how much merely lived in the twisted perception of their own fear. James and Elizabeth sank to the floor, trembling, holding on to each other as the theater loomed silent around them. They knew the world outside had not changed, yet inside, everything had. The opera house had revealed something fundamental about themselves. Fear could be anticipated, seen, and yet survived, if only one moved carefully enough to outlast it. The mirrors behind the walls remained silent, patient, and waiting. And though the siblings had escaped immediate danger, they knew that the opera house would always be there, an ancient vessel of dread, where the living could glimpse the inevitability of death and the fragility of courage. And for those who dared to enter again, the mirrors would watch, showing them truths they might never wish to see. Silence reigned in the room where James and Elizabeth had taken refuge. Yet it was a tenuous, fragile silence. The echoes of the Hall of Mirrors clung to their minds, refusing to release their grip. Every breath, every heartbeat was a reminder of what they had seen and what they had barely survived. The theater outside seemed dormant, its ancient timbers creaking only occasionally, as if considering whether to awaken once more. James pressed his hands to his temples, attempting to clear the remnants of dread that clung there. He had survived the visions, the distortions, the inevitable deaths, but the knowledge lingered. The mirrors had shown them truth, or something close to it. Elizabeth sat beside him, shoulders trembling, staring at a cracked wall where the faint reflection of the main hall shimmered in the dim candlelight. Neither spoke, for fear that words might give life to what they had left behind. Minutes passed, or was it hours? Time had become a fluid, unreliable measure within the theater's walls. They did not know, and neither cared to know. James eventually whispered, his voice hoarse and low. "We have to leave, completely. The streets, the city, it's all waiting." Elizabeth nodded, gripping his hand tightly, as if her fingers alone could tether them to the world beyond the opera house. They rose cautiously, testing the hallways beyond their refuge. The air was cooler here, less oppressive, yet every step seemed weighed by the memory of reflections. The corridors were still lined with mirrors, but here, for the first time, their reflections were calm, unthreatening, seemingly waiting rather than tormenting. James did not dare look too long, fearing that even a single glance might drag them back into the horrors behind. The main hall loomed ahead, vast and shadowed. It appeared quieter, almost indifferent to their presence. The stage was empty, unlit, and the seats bore the marks of absent spectators. Yet James could feel the lingering tension, a presence in the air that did not belong to any human. It was as though the theater itself remembered, waiting patiently for the next visitors who would cross its threshold and meet the inevitable truths contained in glass. Elizabeth tugged at his sleeve. "James, look." She pointed to a mirror near the stage. For a fleeting moment, their reflections appeared, but not entirely. The faces were pale, drawn, etched with exhaustion and fear beyond their years. James caught the reflection of his own hand trembling, though he had forced it still. In the shadows, they seemed older, worn by some unseen torment. The mirror had not yet released them. Suddenly, a sound pierced the oppressive stillness, a creak, then another, rhythmic and deliberate. It came from the stage. The floorboards groaned under invisible weight, a slow approach that echoed through the cavernous hall. James and Elizabeth froze, hearts pounding, yet the sound never revealed its source. It was as if the theater itself moved, its timbers bending in awareness of their presence. Every instinct screamed to run, yet the memory of past corridors, endless and inescapable, restrained them. A shadow moved across the far wall, fleeting and indistinct. In another instant, it was gone. James realized that the opera house had not ended its performance. It had merely paused, patient and watchful. Each mirror in the hall captured subtle, fleeting versions of them, variations on what might come, reflections of their exhaustion, fear, and determination. The theater had become a living archive of their survival, preserving their terror, bending it, yet leaving them alive, if only barely. Elizabeth whispered, voice shaking, "It's waiting for someone else." She shivered, realizing that what they had endured was merely one act in a play without finality. We were just the beginning. James nodded, the weight of understanding settling heavily upon him. The mirrors did not attack, they revealed, they observed, and the opera house would always remember, storing the images of those who dared enter until the next audience arrived to meet the same inevitable truths. A cold draft swept through the hall, brushing against their skin, carrying the faint scent of old wood, wax, and dust. It was neither malevolent nor kind. It was merely presence, the breath of the theater itself. James led Elizabeth toward the exit, each step measured, careful, unwilling to glance into the mirrors. Behind them, shadows shifted subtly, reflections flickered, but the pair refused to acknowledge them. The past horrors remained suspended in glass, distant yet persistent, a reminder that survival had not erased what had been seen. They reached the grand doors, the carved wood gleaming dimly in the final candlelight. James pressed the heavy handle and pulled. The door resisted briefly, as if reluctant to release its captives, then swung open with a groan. Outside, the cold December night wrapped around them, fog curling between cobblestones. The city beyond seemed unchanged, indifferent to the horrors contained within the opera house walls, yet the memory of what they had witnessed clung to them like a second skin. Elizabeth inhaled sharply, shivering. "It's over," she whispered. But James did not reply immediately. He knew the truth. It was not over. The theater would endure, silent, patient, observing every reflection, every secret fear of those who entered. Their survival was only temporary, a reprieve that would not erase the lessons the mirrors had taught. The knowledge remained. They had seen too much, understood too much, and the awareness would haunt them far longer than the terror itself. As they moved away from the theater, the fog swallowed the building in its thick, gray embrace. The lights inside flickered once, then dimmed. The opera house stood still, silent, its walls waiting patiently for the next unwitting audience. Reflections remained behind every pane of glass, storing the images of the past, anticipating the inevitability of the future. James and Elizabeth walked into the night, hearts still pounding, hands clasped tightly. Neither spoke. Words were inadequate. They understood that what they had survived was not merely fear, it was the acknowledgement of inevitability, a confrontation with the fragility of human courage and the relentless passage of time. They had seen themselves fully reflected in the theater's glass and lived to tell the story. Yet the memory would remain. Every creak of a floorboard, every shadow stretching across a wall, every flicker of candlelight in a distant room would echo with the presence of the opera house. The mirrors had not released them entirely. They had merely shifted the weight, storing it in memory, embedding the terror in their minds. No sleep would erase the images. No comfort would erase the echoes. Behind them, the doors closed with a heavy finality, but the theater did not rest. Within its walls, mirrors continued to reflect, waiting silently, patiently, endlessly. For those who would come after, the mirrors would once again reveal truth, inevitability, and fear in its purest form. And the city outside would never know, never suspect, the quiet horrors waiting within the grand, decaying opera house of New York. James and Elizabeth continued through the fog-bound streets, aware that life had resumed around them, yet forever changed. They had survived the Hall of Mirrors, but they carried its lessons in every heartbeat, every glance, every shadow. The opera house would endure, silent and patient, a vessel of observation, a witness to inevitability. And somewhere in the recesses of their minds, the images of reflections, distorted yet precise, would never fade. The haunted opera house had spoken, and for those who entered after them, it would speak again.